All right, so this is my presentation for Module 3. So this is the data. For this module, the data consisted of 4x variables, 4y variables, 7x variables, and 8f variables. Each had 30 values, which as you can see by the photo, it's a lot of values. When looking at the data, I really struggled to come up with a story for the data, something that made sense. The multiple variables and values sent me in a spiral, and I couldn't really rack my brain around an answer to make this make sense to me. So instead of trying to force the data to be something that I understood, and in the process, most likely accidentally manipulating it in some way, I wanted to take the time for this presentation to talk about some of the basics of reliability, as well as data integrity and the importance it has in the field. So these are my x1 and y1 variables. Those were the two variables I decided to focus on. Listed on the slide is the mean, median, standard deviation, and variance of the variables, as well as the results for two correlation tests. We have talked in depth in class about Cronbach's alpha, which I did here, and you can see the results. And it's a measure of reliability. And as a refresher, reliability is the consistency, stability, and how dependable a measure is. The alpha score for the variables was 0.7, which some people view as the threshold for reliability, and then others argue that 0.7 is questionable reliability. Yeah. So these are the graphs that I made to show the correlation and relationship between the variables. On the left is a line graph of the correlation between the two, and on the right is a scatter plot. As you can see, there's a slight correlation going positively. However, this is a cluster, and this you could, if there was a line of best fit, you could draw it definitely, but overall, it's kind of just messy and doesn't look that great. But there's something there for sure. It's just not. Uh, it's not perfect. Um, so this leads me to talking about the article. So in the article by, I'm gonna butcher his name, but Paul Meal, I think that's right. A lot of good, he brings up a lot of good critiques and issues in the field of psychology. And for this, I'll focus on the on 3 points that he made about nuance variables, unknown critical effects, and number of variables. So for nuance variables, it's almost near impossible to rule out causal inferences, therefore correlation is always questionable. Basically, you can never have data that has no influences from the outside world, even if it was a laboratory study and you meticulously did everything to make sure there was no variability. There's always going to be something that happens. I mean, we're dealing with human subjects, everyone's different. Basically, that was the point I was trying to make with that. With when looking at our data, this could be the reason that we got the alpha score that we did. So if correlation is always questionable, 0.7 would be a questionable score. So for unknown critical effects, although this point is more geared towards the clinical psychology people, at least it was in the article, it is still important to mention confounds and when it comes to statistics and analyzing data. Like I said in the point about nuance variables, we're still dealing with human subjects, at least the majority of the time in psychological science. So there's always going to be confounds in the variables because people are people and people are different. Um, the last point I want to bring up is number of variables. This is the most relevant point in terms of this data set. There are just so many variables and values that it is a daunting task even to try to make sense of it. And I know that the few X, Y, and F variables weren't really that many, but from someone who's looking at statistics with relatively fresh eyes, it was a lot. And I wanted to bring up the example in class about the VA's data set and how so many people have looked at it and have just deemed it unanalyzable because of how many variables there are. and just overall because the data set is changing so often. And I think that was the point that he was trying to make with the number of variables statement is just like, if there's so many different things that can happen with human subjects and in the realms of science, the psychological science, it's not really, you can't say that it's a fact, or it's even hard to call it a theory because there's just so many differences that can happen between studies and between replications. So, yeah.